Surviving the Colosseum required way more than just a sharp sword and good reflexes. Fighters had to memorize a bizarre rulebook that dictated everything from the exact angle of their weapons to how they were legally required to stand. We are exposing 50 incredibly strange, perfectly real regulations that turned the ancient arena into the most strictly governed spectacle in history. 1. Contrary to every historical movie you have ever seen, a highly trained gladiator was strictly prohibited from fighting wild animals. The arena was rigidly divided by professional class. Men who fought lions or bears were called bestiarii, and they were officially considered the absolute lowest tier of arena entertainers. True gladiators were elite martial artists who only fought other skilled humans. Asking a champion to fight a wild tiger would be considered a massive insult to his professional dignity. 2. Think the Colosseum was a lawless free-for-all? Wrong. Every single bout featured a senior referee, called the summa rudis, usually a grumpy retired champion who knew every dirty trick. This official stood right inside the striking zone, armed with a long wooden baton. If a fighter broke a rule, ignored a mandatory water break, or showed exceptionally poor sportsmanship, the referee would literally beat them back into compliance. It was a heavily regulated sport featuring a guy ready to whack you with a stick if you fought dirty. 3. Fighting someone your own size was actually against the rules. The matchmaking system was rigorously balanced to ensure maximum entertainment, meaning you were strictly prohibited from facing an opponent with identical equipment. A heavily armored murmillo almost always fought a highly mobile retiarius, armed with just a net and trident. It was a perfectly calculated game of rock, paper, scissors, but with incredibly sharp objects. 4. Private citizens were legally capped on how many gladiators they could own, a strict rule implemented to prevent the sudden rise of private, heavily armed militias. During the imperial era, emperors realized that wealthy politicians were buying up hundreds of highly trained fighters under the guise of hosting extravagant sporting events. To neutralize this massive security threat, the government heavily regulated the market, making it outright illegal for anyone except the emperor to manage a massive stable of warriors within Rome. Could you imagine modern politicians secretly buying sports teams just to start an uprising? 5. Maintaining absolute theatrical professionalism was a non-negotiable regulation. Gladiators were strictly forbidden from engaging in trash talk, flinching, or making facial expressions at the screaming audience while actively fighting. They wore heavy helmets with full face masks, not just for physical protection, but to strip away their humanity, turning them into stoic, emotionless avatars of combat. Reacting to a heckler or a fan's insult was a massive violation of their strict code. You were paid to put on a flawless technical performance, not argue with the cheap seats. 6. Stepping onto the sand was illegal if you felt under the weather. Before any major games, fighters were required to undergo rigorous physical examinations by elite physicians, including some of the most famous medical minds of the ancient world. If a gladiator had a bad limp, an infection, or even a serious cold, the doctor pulled them from the lineup instantly. These men were incredibly expensive investments. Owners refused to waste top-tier talent in an unfair fight just because somebody caught the flu. 7. Losing a fight came with its own set of rigid contractual obligations. If the crowd voted against a surrendered gladiator, they were legally bound by a strict code of absolute silence. Flinching, crying out, or begging for your life at the final moment was considered the ultimate disgrace. The defeated fighter was required to kneel, offer their neck, and accept their fate with unflinching stoicism. How many people today could maintain perfect professional composure during their own execution? 8. Management implemented strict psychological safeguards to prevent emotional complications in the arena. Fighters belonging to the same brotherhood or training under the exact same instructor were heavily protected against being drawn against one another. They ate together, trained together, and formed ancient unions that paid for their funerals. Forcing best friends into a death match was considered terrible for morale and ultimately bad for business. Only under the rarest, highest-paying circumstances could a sponsor demand a clash between literal brothers in arms. 9. Showing up with substandard or dull equipment was a serious offense that resulted in massive fines for the event organizers. Right before the matches began, a formal ceremony required the emperor or the elite sponsor to personally inspect the weapons. This rule guaranteed no one was trying to rig the fights with blunt blades to protect expensive talent from serious harm. The audience paid for genuine danger. Bringing a dull sword to the Colosseum was basically committing ancient consumer fraud. 10. Sunlight provided a massive tactical advantage, so starting positions were mathematically regulated. The Colosseum featured a giant canvas awning, but harsh glare still reached the sand. Referees strictly positioned the fighters so neither man had the sun directly in his eyes when the bout commenced. If a competitor tried to aggressively circle around to intentionally blind his rival with the glare before the first strike, the official halted the match and completely reset their footing. Fair play governed absolutely every angle of the stadium. 11. Fights didn't always have to end with a clear winner and a defeated loser. If both combatants fought brilliantly and completely exhausted themselves without landing a decisive strike, the referee could legally declare a stantes misi. This translates to being dismissed while still standing. It was an official, highly recognized tie. The audience actually respected a hard-fought draw, allowing both men to walk away with their honor intact. Who says ancient Rome didn't appreciate a fair compromise? 12. Female gladiators, officially known as gladiatrices, were completely real, but they operated under a very different set of scheduling rules. They rarely fought during the main afternoon events. Instead, the rules usually relegated their matches to the late evening, forcing them to fight by the dramatic, flickering light of torches. This nighttime scheduling was designed to make their matches feel like exotic novelty acts. Eventually, Emperor Septimius Severus officially banned these spectacles in 200 AD. 13. You couldn't just walk into the Colosseum using your ordinary legal birth name. Entering the profession required adopting an official stage name, a strict rule designed to completely separate your brutal arena persona from your private life. Fighters chose intimidating monikers based on mythological heroes, fierce animals, or boastful adjectives like victor. It was the ancient equivalent of modern wrestling personas. Imagine an accountant named Bob legally changing his name to the Destroyer for work. 14. Quitting a match wasn't as simple as dropping your sword and running for the exit. If a fighter wanted to surrender, the rulebook demanded a highly specific, standardized gesture. You had to raise a single index finger to the referee, formally requesting clemency. Toss away your heavy shield? That worked too. But giving up without the proper visual paperwork was strictly off-limits. The emperor then consulted the roaring crowd to decide your fate. Could you imagine modern athletes needing a stadium's permission just to take a timeout? 15. Gladiator bouts were completely accompanied by a live soundtrack, and fighters had to pay incredibly close attention to the rhythm. A band featuring water organs and horns played constantly during the match. The musicians would actively change the tempo to match the action, and fighters were expected to pace their footwork to this live music. It transformed the fight into a highly choreographed, rhythmic dance of survival. Doesn't that make the Colosseum sound surprisingly like extreme musical theater? 16. The officials monitoring the fights were bound by their own rigid dress code to ensure absolute authority. Referees were never allowed to wear armor or carry defensive shields, a rule that emphasized their untouchable status within the combat zone. They wore brilliant white tunics featuring distinctive purple borders, instantly marking them as representatives of the law. This high-visibility uniform guaranteed that the heavily armed, adrenaline-fueled combatants would never mistake them for a target, even in the chaotic heat of a close struggle. 17. Winning a tough match didn't mean you could immediately hit the showers and relax. Victors were legally required to complete a formal, highly structured award ceremony right on the sand. The winner had to approach the sponsor's box, receive a ceremonial palm branch, and collect a silver tray piled high with their prize money. After securing the cash, they were mandated to run a celebratory victory lap. Skipping this public relations requirement was a massive breach of professional arena protocol. 18. The night before a major event, all competing fighters were mandated to attend the Cena Libera, a lavish public banquet. This wasn't a private team dinner. It was entirely open to the general public. Fans, gamblers, and curious locals could wander in, observe the athletes eating, and try to guess who looked the strongest before placing their bets. It functioned exactly like a modern pre-fight weigh-in and press conference. Would you want strangers watching you eat right before a massive career test? 19. Volunteering for the arena required signing away your basic human rights through a terrifying, legally binding contract called the sacramentum. By swearing this absolute oath, a free citizen legally agreed to be bound, beaten, and ultimately risk everything in the arena. The moment you spoke those exact words in front of a Roman magistrate, you officially dropped to the absolute lowest social class in the empire, losing all legal protections. It was the most extreme employment contract in history. 20. You couldn't just quit the profession when you felt like it, or saved up enough prize money. Retirement had to be officially earned and publicly granted by receiving the rudis, a ceremonial wooden sword. This was only awarded after years of exceptional service or surviving a seemingly impossible, legendary match. Earning the rudis instantly nullified your arena contract and restored your status as a free civilian. Until that wooden sword touched your hand, your life belonged exclusively to the school. 21. You couldn't just join a gladiator school and keep a low profile. By law, new recruits were required to receive permanent, highly visible tattoos, usually on their hands, legs, or even their faces. These marks weren't decorative tribal art meant to make them look intimidating to the crowd. They were official property stamps, legally identifying them as assets of the Roman state or a private owner. It was an ancient tracking system designed to make running away absolutely impossible. Would you get a corporate logo tattooed on your face for a job? 22. Practicing your combat moves with actual, sharpened weapons was strictly forbidden inside the training barracks. To prevent highly valuable athletes from accidentally injuring each other during routine drills, all daily sparring was done using specifically crafted wooden swords. However, to make this rule even more punishing, these wooden training tools were legally required to be twice as heavy as their metal counterparts. This mandate forced fighters to build incredible stamina and shoulder strength before they ever touched a real blade. 23. Stepping directly from the locker room to the combat zone wasn't an option. Before any actual fighting commenced, every gladiator was legally required to participate in the Pampa, a massive, highly theatrical pre-game parade. Fighters were mandated to march through the city streets and into the Colosseum wearing extravagant, incredibly heavy cloaks woven with gold and purple thread. It was essentially a mandatory high-stakes fashion show designed to hype up the crowd. They had to act like untouchable celebrities right until the weapons were drawn. 24. If your opponent genuinely tripped over a rock, slipped on a slick patch of sand, or simply lost their footing without you actively striking them, you were strictly forbidden from attacking them while they were down. The referee would literally halt the match and force you to step back until the fallen fighter regained their footing. Fair play was paramount to ensuring the crowd got a satisfying, highly technical display of skill. 25. Every fighter had to pay regular monthly dues into a shared pool known as a collegium. This wasn't a retirement fund, but rather an ancient life insurance policy managed entirely by the fighters themselves. If a member met an unfortunate end in the arena, this fund guaranteed they received a proper, highly respectful burial and a carved tombstone. Even in a profession built around combat, skipping your union fees was heavily frowned upon. 26. First-day rookies were completely banned from wearing the flashy, customized armor seen on veteran champions. These novices, officially classified as Tyrones, had to follow incredibly strict uniform regulations. They were restricted to wearing basic, standardized gear and were often paired together in the less desirable opening matches. You had to survive your probationary debut and prove your technical competence to the demanding crowd before management would allow you to upgrade to the iconic, customized helmets and decorated shields. You literally had to earn your legendary outfit. 27. Your dietary choices were strictly controlled by the training school, completely ruining the illusion of the protein-shredded warrior. Gladiators were officially mandated to consume massive quantities of barley, beans, and oatmeal, earning them the somewhat insulting nickname of barley men. This extreme carb loading wasn't for general health. It was explicitly designed to build a thick layer of subcutaneous fat. That extra padding ensured superficial flesh wounds would bleed spectacularly for the crowd's entertainment without actually hitting vital organs. They were literally required to stay slightly chubby. 28. Throwing back a few cups of liquid courage before stepping onto the sand was explicitly banned by arena management. Gladiators were forced to abide by strict sobriety rules on the day of a major event. While wine was a staple of the standard Roman diet, competing under the influence was viewed as incredibly dangerous and totally disrespectful to the highly refined art of combat. The sponsors paid a fortune for peak athletic performance, not a clumsy, uncoordinated tavern brawl. You had to face 80,000 screaming fans completely and utterly sober. 29. Refusing physical therapy was a clear breach of your arena contract. If a gladiator suffered a non-lethal injury, they were legally mandated to undergo incredibly intense, often highly uncomfortable rehabilitation protocols designed by the top sports physicians of the era. This included mandatory deep tissue massages, strictly monitored rest periods, and early forms of physical therapy involving weighted resistance. You were a massively expensive financial asset, and management absolutely refused to let a sprained ankle or a torn muscle ruin their multi-thousand coin investment. You recovered on their schedule, not yours. 30. Inside the training barracks, speaking out of turn to your instructor was a punishable offense. The men who trained gladiators, known as doctors, were often terrifying former champions who demanded absolute, unwavering silence during instructional drills. Fighters were required to communicate almost entirely through specific, highly standardized nods and gestures while actively holding their heavy wooden weapons. This strict rule instilled extreme discipline, ensuring that when the overwhelming noise of the roaring Colosseum finally surrounded them, they could fight entirely on pure, uninterrupted muscle memory. 31. Daily trips to the bathhouse weren't a relaxing luxury, they were a heavily enforced sanitary regulation. Roman gladiator schools forced their fighters to scrape off dirt and sweat using a specialized metal tool called a strigil every single afternoon. These strict hygienic protocols existed to prevent minor training scrapes from turning into fatal infections, which would ruin a massive financial investment. If you skipped your mandatory scrub down, the instructors penalized you severely. Management cared deeply about your skincare routine, strictly because a healthy fighter was a profitable fighter. 32. The main event never started cold. Before the actual match, fighters were contractually obligated to perform the prolutio. This was a mandatory warm-up session where gladiators demonstrated their agility and complex striking techniques using totally blunted wooden weapons. It allowed the massive crowd to safely evaluate the athletes' forms before placing their final bets. Only after the referee blew a loud horn were they allowed to switch to live steel. Would you want 80,000 people aggressively critiquing your stretching routine? 33. Referees strictly prohibited cheap street fighting tactics on the sand. While the ultimate goal was extreme physical dominance, specific moves like biting or intentional strikes to the groin were completely illegal. The Roman audience viewed gladiatorial combat as an elevated, highly technical martial art, not a desperate tavern brawl. If a fighter attempted to blind his opponent with a dirty finger jab, the official halted the match immediately and delivered a harsh physical reprimand with his baton. Honor in the arena meant winning exclusively through superior technical skill. 34. Your personal property legally belonged to your owner the moment you swore the gladiator's oath, creating a bizarre financial paradox. Even if a famous fighter earned massive piles of silver coins from generous sponsors, they technically had no legal right to draft a civilian will. If a champion unexpectedly died, all his accumulated wealth automatically reverted back to the training school's management. To bypass this depressing rule, fighters utilized secret, informal pacts within their unions to ensure their unofficial spouses and children actually received the cash. 35. Hollywood absolutely lied to you about the famous phrase, "Emperor, we who are about to die salute you." Gladiators were entirely forbidden from using this dramatic chant before a standard match. Historical records show this theatrical greeting was only utilized once in all of Roman history, specifically during a massive spectacle staged by Emperor Claudius involving condemned criminals. For standard arena fights, demanding that the emperor acknowledge your impending doom was considered incredibly presumptuous. You were expected to offer a silent, respectful bow, not scream dramatic catchphrases. 36. Massive security details surrounded top fighters on their way to the stadium, but it wasn't just to prevent them from running away. Elite champions faced intense harassment from rabid superfans, obsessive gamblers, and wealthy admirers looking for a souvenir. The rulebook mandated heavy escorts to physically shield the athletes from the chaotic Roman public. If a star fighter got injured by a crazed fan pulling at his cloak in the streets, the event sponsor lost a fortune. It was essentially ancient paparazzi protection for heavily armed celebrities. 37. A dropped weapon didn't result in automatic death, but it did trigger a highly specific referee protocol. If a sword slipped from a sweaty hand, the official instantly stepped between the fighters and paused the action. The unarmed gladiator was completely allowed to retrieve his weapon, but he suffered a massive deduction in his overall performance score from the judges. The crowd despised clumsiness. You could pick your shield back up, but the lingering shame practically guaranteed the audience would vote against you if you surrendered later. 38. Long, flowing locks of hair were completely banned on the arena floor for incredibly obvious tactical reasons. Any gladiator who didn't wear a fully enclosed heavy helmet was required to keep their hair cropped exceptionally short or tightly braided against their skull. Beards were also heavily regulated and often shaved off entirely. Management strictly enforced this rigid grooming code so opponents couldn't grab a handful of hair to pull a fighter off balance. Looking stylish was absolutely secondary to preventing a totally embarrassing tactical takedown. 39. A massive breakfast on the morning of a major event was completely forbidden. Following the lavish public banquet the night before, fighters were required to undergo a strict, heavily monitored fasting period. Competing on a completely empty stomach was a carefully calculated medical rule. If a fighter suffered a deep abdominal wound, having an empty digestive tract significantly lowered the risk of catastrophic internal infection. It sounds incredibly grim, but it was a mandated safety protocol. Could you focus on surviving while dealing with intense hunger pangs? 40. Total isolation from the outside world was strictly enforced during the final, crucial weeks of training. Gladiators were officially confined to their heavily guarded barracks, barred from visiting local taverns or seeing their families. This severe lockdown prevented rival gambling syndicates from attempting to bribe, poison, or intimidate the athletes right before a massive tournament. The training school functioned exactly like an ultra-secure vault, locking away its most valuable human assets to ensure the absolute integrity of the games. Do you think modern sports could benefit from this level of anti-corruption lockdown? 41. Before any rookie could officially debut in front of a paying audience, a master of the training school demanded a rigorous final exam. Trainees had to demonstrate absolute technical perfection during an intense, highly monitored mock fight. If a candidate failed to impress the strict judges, management instantly downgraded them to a lower, highly undesirable entertainment tier or sold them off entirely. The owners demanded flawless execution before letting anyone represent their expensive brand. 42. The Thrax gladiator wielded a distinct curved sword called a sika, but strict mathematical rules governed its precise shape. Roman blacksmiths were legally barred from forging this specific blade past a predetermined angle. A deeper curve would easily hook around a standard shield, completely ruining the competitive balance of the highly structured sport. Officials meticulously measured these swords before every match to ensure total fairness. 43. Some specialized matches required competitors to fight completely blind. The Andabatai were a rare, highly specific class of arena entertainers who wore restrictive metal helmets without any eye holes whatsoever. They relied entirely on their hearing to locate their opponents, often wildly swinging their weapons at empty air. Organizers usually deployed these heavily armored, sightless warriors during the midday intermission purely as a form of tense comic relief. The massive audience loved it. 44. Direct communication with the emperor was entirely forbidden unless a fighter was explicitly requested to speak. If the absolute ruler attended the games, gladiators had to wait in profound silence for his royal, visual signal before the matches could officially commence. Breaking this rigid protocol to beg for a favor or ask for freedom before the fight was a massive, unforgivable insult to the Roman hierarchy. You simply kept your mouth firmly shut until the most powerful man on earth addressed you directly. 45. Hosting a match where surrender was explicitly forbidden was actually illegal for a significant portion of Roman history. Emperor Augustus formally banned the practice of staging bouts sine missione, meaning fights that guaranteed one person would not survive. He realized that automatically discarding incredibly expensive, highly trained athletes was a terrible economic strategy for the empire. The crowd still demanded high stakes, but the law legally guaranteed every defeated fighter at least a chance to beg for official clemency. 46. The dual-wielding Dimacharius class faced incredibly unique and restrictive matchmaking protocols. Arena managers only allowed these twin-blade fighters to battle opponents with identical, hyper-aggressive weapon loadouts. Matching a two-sword berserker against a heavily shielded defensive opponent was considered incredibly boring to the refined Roman spectator. They demanded high-speed, relentless offense from both combatants to justify the exorbitant ticket prices. Do you think you could survive without a shield? 47. Liberty possessed an official price tag, but the financial system was heavily rigged against the superstar athletes. A fighter was allowed to keep a small percentage of his prize money to eventually buy his ultimate freedom. However, the rulebook permitted owners to arbitrarily inflate this buyout price if the gladiator became exceptionally popular. Even if an athlete saved a mountain of silver, the boss could legally double his price tag overnight, just to keep a top earner permanently trapped in the arena system. 48. Barrack sleeping arrangements were strictly segregated by specific fighting styles to maintain theatrical suspense. Heavily armored champions were locked entirely away from the nimble, lightly armed fighters during the evening hours. Management deeply feared that if different classes mingled and chatted over dinner, they would figure out each other's tactical weaknesses and completely ruin the surprise of the upcoming games. Total secrecy between the specialized divisions was a heavily mandated business strategy. 49. Stadium management followed extremely precise guidelines regarding the exact type of dirt used on the fighting floor. Organizers didn't just scoop up random soil from outside the city walls. They specifically imported a highly absorbent, perfectly textured sand known as harina. This material was meticulously leveled and sometimes even dyed red to hide unsightly stains from the audience. The texture had to provide flawless traction for the athletes' leather sandals, ensuring nobody slipped and ruined a highly anticipated technical matchup. We've scrutinized 49 bizarre regulations, and only one remains. But before we hit number 50, it's time for our final verdict. The award for the absolute dumbest rule in history goes to the mandatory carb-loading diet to stay intentionally chubby. Imagine being an elite warrior forced to shovel down barley and beans just to develop a layer of protective fat. It's the ultimate insult to athletic excellence. Do you agree with our pick? Or did another rule take the crown of stupidity? Let us know in the comments. Now, for our final number, 50. The ultimate regulation demanded absolute perfection during the final moments of a condemned opponent. If a defeated fighter was sentenced by the event sponsor, the victor had to deliver the final strike flawlessly, without any hesitation, flinching, or a single whispered word of apology. Showing any form of mercy or emotional reluctance was treated as direct treason against the highest authorities. You were a highly paid instrument of the state's entertainment, and instruments are legally required to lack a conscience. We constantly hear about modern sports stars complaining about bad referees, strict diets, and exhausting training schedules. Considering the extreme restrictions of the Colosseum, Do you think today's highest-paid American athletes would survive a single week of a gladiator's schedule? Drop your most controversial take below. Prove you love real history by liking this video and subscribing.